It's coming.
All these voices.
We had tons of activity, including a demon attack that called JC, the founder of Shadows Pit Paranormal, to puke all over the place like projectile vomit. It was insane, and he got scratched on the neck. We captured a disembodied face that was screaming, and we also captured a couple different full-body apparitions, which was badass. Now, Baba Yaga was a Slavic witch, but she was also a supernatural guardian. And basically what she did was beat back the forces of evil from the realm of the dead, made a deal with a bunch of witches in the woods in Armenia. She sold her soul. And I am standing out here in the damn rain. I should have listened to my wife. She told me, if you're going out, bring an umbrella. I don't listen. Now I'm getting wet, so I'm sheltering underneath this tree. A nasty creature that I have actually had a run-in with myself. The bastard scratched the hell out of my car and jumped on. It was a mess. I tell the story in the show.
Are you watching? Getting a lot of activity. The spirit box is saying Satan, Paimon, and other major demons, and chanting and singing and whispering. We've never had that before. So you guys are going to have a great episode coming. The camera guy got attacked right now while we were talking. He got scratched. He said something scratched his back, and I looked at his back, and it's got a scratch on it, guys. There's the picture right there.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staring into the Abyss. I am your host, horror author James Hershey Jr., and with me as always, my co-host, old boy James Ash. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. How's everybody tonight?
If you are a listener of this show, then you know that I love history. One thing that I see a lot is history that people give out that never actually happened. So that's what this show is going to be about. It's going to be about some of the biggest myths that are passed along to us as real history. Some of these things were actually even taught in high school. You know, when I went to school, in my history classes, some of these things were in the books, and they're simply not true. Some will come from the Bible, some will come from popular culture, and some will come from historical figures and historical events. I have a whole lot of these. I don't know how many of them I'll get through, but we'll see what we can do. We'll see what we can get through. We're going to start off with one from the Bible, and that is that Eve ate the apple, the forbidden fruit. It does say in the Bible that Eve ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Nowhere in the Bible, though, does it say that the forbidden fruit that Eve ate was actually an apple. It is simply called the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden in Genesis 3:3, and it's also called the fruit of the tree from the knowledge of good and evil. Now, it might have been an apple, but most likely it wasn't, because apples weren't very common in that area. Because basically most scholars agree that Eden was somewhere in the Middle East, in that area. And in that area, there's not a whole lot of apples growing. Most likely, it was like a mango, an apricot, fig, or something like that. We'll really never know because the Bible doesn't say that. We are just told that that is true. There's a lot of these kind of myths that are in the Bible. Another one is the devil. The image that we have of the devil as being, red with the goatee and the pitchfork and the horns and the long devil's tail. That's the image that we're always given of Lucifer, of Satan. That simply is not in the Bible anywhere to be found. Lucifer was an angel. He was God's favorite, and he was cast down because he rebelled against God. So logic would suggest that he's going to look like angels look. He's not going to look like the Halloween costumes that we all know and grew up with. We're going to stick on apples for this next one, and that is Sir Isaac Newton. The fact that he was hit by an apple when he discovered gravity. Now, the story goes that Newton was hanging out underneath a tree, just minding his own business, and an apple fell out of the tree and bonked him on his head. And from that, it inspired him to come up with the laws of gravity. The story of the apple falling from the tree, it's a good story, but most likely it never happened. The story was first published in an essay by Voltaire, and it was long after Newton's death. Before that story was published, Newton's niece, Catherine Conduit, was the only person who ever told that story. And it is almost definitely exactly that, just a story, an invention, a falsehood. Don't know actually how he came up with the theory of gravity, but most likely it was through doing science stuff like math and experiments and stuff like that. I doubt very seriously he was just hanging out, having a siesta under a tree, and an apple bonked him on his head. The next one is that Walt Disney drew Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse is probably the most well-known and most famous, not only cartoon character in the world, but maybe even the most famous fictitious character in the world. And it's credited to Walt Disney. Mickey was actually the vision of Disney's #1 animator, Ub Iwerks. Walt Disney wasn't that great of an artist, and he would always have trouble drawing Mickey Mouse throughout his whole lifetime. But this guy, Ub Iwerks, he was an amazing artist, and he was a super fast artist as well. Sometimes he would draw an entire cartoon in like a week. It was really unbelievable, and he's the one that actually came up with the drawing for Mickey Mouse. He's the one that actually drew it. The next one is a real famous one. We've seen it uttered by Kirsten Dunst in a movie. This is one that's taught in classrooms around the country and around the world probably. And that is Marie Antoinette and the fact that she said, "Let them eat cake." In 1766, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote an incident he recalled from like 25 years earlier, in which a great princess was told that the country people had no bread. And this princess replied, "Then let them eat cake." Now, the princess was never named in the incident that he wrote of. When he wrote of this, Marie Antoinette was only an 11-year-old child in Austria. And the French Revolution did not actually begin for another 23 years. The myth that she spoke these infamous words was most likely spread by the revolutionary propagandist. And they did this to illustrate her indifference to the plight of the French people and the fact that she was cold-hearted. It was meant to be like, they said, oh, they have no food, they can't eat, they can't feed themselves. And she basically said, screw them, let them eat cake. Which I don't see how let them eat cake is really that bad of a thing. I think cake is much better than bread. If I had my choice between a loaf of that stale-ass French-looking bread and a nice piece of cake, I'm taking cake every time. Even if she would have said it, I don't see where it was that big of a deal, but she almost certainly didn't. Because like I said, when it was written about, she was only 11 years old. The next one has to do with Van Gogh, and that is the story that he sliced off his ear before he killed himself and sent it to a woman that he was in love with. That is not entirely true. There is a little bit of truth to that. He did kill himself. He only had sold, I think, like one painting before he died. He became a great master artist after his death. And that's usually the way it works with artists. Not only painters, but writers and a lot of different fields. You usually don't get a whole lot of fame and fortune while you're alive. That's where that whole starving artist thing comes from. Usually you struggle a bit. And then after you die, people kind of realize the genius of your work. If you're a genius. If you suck, then they're going to say you suck after you die too, I imagine. But he spent the majority of his life actually teaching art and dealing art. He only spent like 8 years of his life painting. The rest of it, he was just a teacher and he sold art. He didn't slice off his entire ear. That's the point of this. He just cut off a small portion of the left earlobe and sent it off. Now, yes, that sucks. It hurts. And it's absolutely kind of nuts. To say that, well, since he only cut off a little bit of his earlobe, it's not as crazy as if he cut off his whole ear. I wouldn't go that far. I would say that's pretty nuts either way. But he didn't slice off his entire ear and mail it. It was just a little bit of the earlobe. The next one is the Salem witch trials. The thing about the Salem witch trials, that everybody thinks that the witches, first of all, they all think that the witches were all female. And that's not the case. 6 of the witches were men. There were 31 total witches that were found guilty and condemned to death in the Salem witch trials. 150 people were actually arrested for witchcraft, but only 31 of them were tried, and I believe 20 of them were actually executed out of those 31. There's a lot of different misconceptions. They weren't actually burned at the stake either. None of the witches were burned at the stake. That's what we are all taught, and that's what we believe when we think of the Salem witch trials. We think of witchcraft in general. It's always witches being burned at the stake. But it didn't actually happen in Salem witch trials at all. The witch hunters knew that a true witch could never be killed by being burnt at the stake. That's in their writings. So what they usually did was hang them. Sometimes they would crush them to death with heavy stones as well, but usually the way that they would kill the witches was by hanging. Being hung, while painful and while it definitely accomplishes the task of killing you, is not as dramatic as being burnt at the stake. It doesn't have that flair that makes a story memorable. So that's most likely why that was brought up. Plus, it was probably a correlation to the hellfire, because they believe that witches made a pact with the devil, and that meant they were going to hell, and so they would be burning for all eternity. So that might be how the story got spread. I'm not sure. But if you go back and look at the records, none of them were actually burnt. They were all hung. I think one of them in the Salem witch trials was crushed with heavy stones. But throughout Europe, it was a more common practice to crush them with heavy stones and hang them. The next one is Napoleon. Everybody remembers Napoleon as this tiny little fella who had little guy syndrome. Because he was so short and so small in stature, he had to prove himself, and that's why he took over most of the known world. That's what we're taught about Napoleon, but that's not the truth. Napoleon was called La Petite Corporale, which is French for the little corporal. But it didn't have to do with his height, because Napoleon was actually 5'7" tall. And you may say now 5'7" is not very tall. To me, Napoleon probably wouldn't even come up to my nipples. So to me, he would be a little fella. But for that time period, Napoleon was actually taller than the average person, at least the average 18th century Frenchman. So you might ask yourself, well, why did they call him the little corporal if he was taller than most people? The reason why they called him the little corporal goes all the way back to really early, near the beginning of his military career. The soldiers used to mock him because he was a low rank, but he had aspirations to be a high rank. He carried himself as if he was already a general, you know what I mean? But he was just a very low rank. And that's how he got the nickname Little Corporal. Little because of his low rank, and corporal because he thought he was an officer when he was just a little bitty nobody. And the name stuck. Even after he became ruler of France and did all the things that we remember him for in history, that name stuck. And that's why people nowadays think of Napoleon as a tiny little guy, when in reality he was actually taller than most people. The next one is that King John signed the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta, it's also known as the Great Charter, is known as a landmark document in history. And what it did was it limited the power of the King of England, and it sowed the seeds of democracy throughout the world. Paintings show King John reluctantly signing the Magna Carta in a meadow at Runnymede in 1215. The problem with that is that King John was illiterate. And if you actually look at one of the 4 original Magna Cartas that still exist today, you will see that there was no signature on the Magna Carta. He simply stamped it with the royal seal because he was not capable of signing his name because he was illiterate. The next one has to do with potatoes and tobacco and how they got to England. We're taught that Sir Walter Raleigh introduced potatoes and tobacco to England, but that was not true. He was one of the greatest mythical figures ever to come from England. Now, he wasn't mythical, he was a real person. But what I meant was there's a mythos around him about some of the things he accomplished. And they weren't true. I mean, he was an explorer. He did a lot of different things, but he did not bring potatoes and tobacco to England. They also say that he was like a very handsome, dashing man and all this charming and everything like that. But that's not what the written accounts of the day say. According to the written accounts of the day, he was not that good looking. He was rather plain looking. But the weird thing is that he did charm Queen Elizabeth I, and he did have a reputation in that time period as being a ladies' man. But when he's described, they describe him as a plain looking guy. Now, another thing about Sir Walter Raleigh that is in legend is the whole thing about laying his cloak down across the mud puddle so that the Queen could step on his cloak instead of getting wet. Okay, that's where that whole idea of that gentlemanly thing where you lay your coat down on a mud puddle and let a woman cross, that comes from that legend. The problem is that's not true at all. It never happened. They said that he introduced potatoes to England in 1586, but potatoes were actually first grown in Italy, and they were grown in 1585. So a year before he was supposedly bringing those potatoes from America back, the very first potatoes were actually being grown in Italy. And they spread from Italy throughout Europe across the English Channel. A lot of people say he brought tobacco. So they blame him for cigarettes and pipe tobacco and all that. But it wasn't him. It was actually Jean Nicot, which nicotine is named after. And he's the one that introduced tobacco to France in 1560. So that was 26 years before Raleigh was supposedly bringing his stuff back. And that also spread to England from France across the channel. The next one is about Magellan. And it's the legend that he circumnavigated the world. We're taught two main things about Magellan. And the first is that he was the first man to circumnavigate the world, which means travel around the entire world. And the second is that during that trip, he was killed by natives in the Philippines. Now, those two things that we're taught about him, they kind of contradict each other. Okay, if he was killed by natives in the Philippines, then that means he only made it halfway around the world. So he wasn't actually the first man to circumnavigate the world because he only made it halfway, and he was killed. Now, his second in command, Juan Sebastian Elcanco, he did complete the circumnavigation, and he was actually the first person to circumnavigate the world. This next one is going to be about ancient Rome and Nero. Now, this is a story that I have heard countless times, and it was always one of my favorite stories in history. I used to read my history books, and I would read about the Emperor Nero and how he fiddled while Rome burned. Great story. The story comes from like 64 AD, and basically it says that Nero started the Great Fire of Rome, and then while the city was burning down, he was dancing around playing his fiddle, overlooking the city burning. Now, this is unfortunately 100% untrue. It's impossible, actually. The first reason it's impossible is because the violin, which is what a fiddle is, wouldn't be invented for another 1600 years. Okay, so there's absolutely no possible way that he fiddled while Rome burned because there were no fiddles. You would have to wait another 1600 years for the first violin to be invented. Now, some versions of this story suggest that he wasn't playing a fiddle, that he was playing a lute or a lyre. The problem with that is that if you look at what all the scholars say, all the historians, and all the documents that are available for that time period, they actually place Emperor Nero at his villa in Antium, which was 30 miles away from Rome when the fire started. So he couldn't very well have started the fire if he was 30 miles away. 30 miles back then was a lot further away than 30 miles is now. The distance was the same. That is absolutely true. That's obvious. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is now, if I want to travel 30 miles, then I hop in my car, get on the interstate, and I'm there in 20-25 minutes. Back then, if you wanted to travel 30 miles, you either got on a horse and rode, or you walked, or you got in a wagon that was pulled by horses, or a chariot that was pulled by horses. Chariots were usually used mostly for battle, but it was a way you could travel if you wanted to. Now, you would not get there in 20-25 minutes, so 30 miles was a lot further back then, as far as time would go. Nero is completely innocent, at least of actually setting the fire himself. Now, if he ordered the fire set, that we don't know. There's no evidence of that, but I can't say that it never happened, because like I said, you just don't know. But we do know that he did not set the fire himself, and we do know that he could not have played the fiddle because they simply did not exist. This next one is going to be about Shakespeare, and probably, if not the most famous play that is credited to him, then the second most. Now, there's debate whether Hamlet is the most successful and the most popular and the most well-known, or whether Romeo and Juliet is. Both very good plays. But the problem is he didn't write it. Okay, now Shakespeare is known as the greatest playwright who ever lived. But the problem is the majority of Shakespeare's plays were not original to Shakespeare. They weren't his plays. He didn't write them. What he did was he would take earlier stories and he would adapt them for the stage. That's what happened with Hamlet. The tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, was most likely his most famous play. But that was actually based on an ancient Scandinavian story. So what he basically did was he took an old Scandinavian legend and he turned it into Hamlet. So he didn't actually write Hamlet, but he adapted Hamlet. So I would still say that it was most likely still Shakespeare's work, because it wasn't complete plagiarism, because he did adapt it to the stage, and I'm sure he changed a couple things around. But it wasn't a completely original piece of work. And that's the thing about Shakespeare that not a lot of people realize is the majority of his work was not original. The majority of the stuff he did was he just found good stories that he liked and he said, hey, I'm going to make a play out of this. That's basically what Shakespeare did. The next one is that America became independent on July 4th, 1776. Now, they may have signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, but America didn't actually become independent then because the Revolutionary War went on for another 7 years after they signed the Declaration of Independence. Actual independence from England was actually finally granted on September 3rd, 1783. And on that day, Britain's George III and the leaders of the Continental Armies signed the definitive Treaty of Peace. Now that is when America actually became independent. We celebrate July 4th as Independence Day, but it really wasn't. It was September 3rd. The reason we celebrate July 4th is because that's when we first made the decision and actually signed the letter that says, hey, screw you, England. We're not putting up with your crap anymore. We're going to be free. But we didn't actually become independent on July 4th. It was September 3rd. This next one is about Thomas Edison. And it's the idea that he invented the electric light. Thomas Edison is known as the world's greatest inventor. He has more patents than anybody. He has 1,093 patents. The problem with Edison, and I don't really care much, honestly, for Thomas Edison, because Thomas Edison was kind of a prick. He stole everybody's work. That's what he did. I mean, the feud with Tesla is infamous about who's going to supply power, whether it's going to be AC or DC. That's a whole nother show I'll do some other time. But Edison was not this genius that everybody thinks he was. Basically, what Edison would do is find people that were actual geniuses who had amazing inventions that they were coming up with and steal them and then patent them so that he could profit from them. This is basically what happened with the electric light. The electric light actually existed before Edison was born. Now that sounds crazy, but I'm going to explain this to you. 4 decades before Edison was born, 40 years, an English scientist by the name of Sir Humphrey Davy invented arc lighting, and he used a carbon filament. For many years after that, there were numerous different innovators that would try to improve on Davy's model. The majority of those improvements had to do with the filament, the carbon filament, because the problem with the carbon filament is it didn't last very long. Okay, it would only burn or glow for around 12 hours before the filament would break and burn out. What Edison did was not invent electric light. What Edison did was find the right filament that could burn for multiple days. That was an achievement, but he was not the first person to do electric light. And also, Edison went through hundreds of different materials before he found the proper materials to make a light bulb that actually burnt for a long time instead of burning out in 12 hours. The next one on the list is that Columbus proved that the earth was round. Now, people have this idea about Columbus and what he did, and the overwhelming majority of what people think they know about Christopher Columbus simply isn't true. We're taught in school that Columbus discovered America. That is 100% false. Columbus never set foot on America. He made it to the Bahamas. That's as close as he got, which is not America. Columbus also was not trying to prove the earth was round. That's another thing we're taught in school. We're taught in school that in the time of Columbus, everybody thought that the world was completely flat, and that if you sailed too far in one direction, that you'd fall right off the edge. That's simply not true. Columbus did not believe that the earth was flat. That's true. But the majority of people during that time did not believe that the earth was flat. That's a common misconception that a lot of people have. We're taught that in history, but it's just not true. If you look at all the documentation from that time period, most people knew that the world was round. As a matter of fact, American author Washington Irving 500 years after Columbus sailed to America. He's the one that first portrayed Columbus as going on this voyage to prove that the earth was round. And he said that it defied the common flat earth belief of the time. Now, that's how this idea got started. 500 years after Columbus, an author said, hey, this is what happened. Nowadays, here's another author right here in me telling you that's not what happened. The truth is that most educated Europeans in Columbus's day knew that the world was round. Okay, since the 4th century BC, there was almost nobody that believed the earth was flat. Columbus actually believed that the earth was more of a pear shape. But he didn't even set sail to prove that. It had nothing to do with the shape of the earth. The reason that Columbus went on his voyage was to prove that Asia was a lot closer than anyone thought it was. And he wanted to set up a faster trade route. That's why Columbus did what he did. It had nothing to do with proving the earth was round. Even in what he was actually trying to prove, he was wrong. And like I said, he never set foot on America. And he ended up getting to the Bahamas, where basically he screwed over the people there, and he wasn't a good guy at all. So this idea that he's a hero is nonsense. This idea that he proved the earth was round, again, nonsense. That was a commonly held belief even before Columbus was born. And the fact that we have a Columbus Day that we celebrate is ludicrous, in my opinion, because he was a failure. He didn't accomplish the goal he set out to accomplish. He didn't discover America. He didn't bring any real new knowledge or anything good. Basically what he did was he found an island, and he screwed over and enslaved the local people there. I mean, that to me is not worthy of a holiday. The next one is about Gandhi, another guy that gets a lot of credit that probably isn't deserved as much as he gets. To most people, Mahatma Gandhi was the most famous leader of India's independence movement. Now, he does deserve credit for promoting the ancient ideals of nonviolence. Okay, it's like, I believe it's called ahimsa or something like that in Indian. But most historians agree that Indian independence was actually inevitable. It was going to happen regardless, because there was multiple leaders that were pushing for it and working towards it. So it was going to happen whether Gandhi was there or not. He was just one of several independence leaders. The Indian National Congress was founded as early as 1885. Okay, at that time, Gandhi was only 16 years old. So as you can see, this independence movement had been going on since he was a teenager. So it wasn't like Gandhi's the only guy that stood up and said, I'm going to make everybody free because I'm just going to be nonviolent. That's just not the truth. It's a good story, but it's just not the truth. The fact is that it was a struggle that was carried on over many, many years by a hell of a lot of people to get freedom for India. And the truth is that Gandhi's civil disobedience was actually only a very small part of the movement. And there are a lot of historians that say that India would have actually gotten independence sooner if they would have focused on the more forceful methods that had been being used for like 50 years before that. And a lot of the other independence leaders actually still advocated. If they would have stuck to that, then they would have gotten independence a lot sooner. The main guy who was opposite of Gandhi, who was another independence leader who was trying to do it through force, was I'm going to butcher this name just so you know. It's Netaji Chandra Bose. He's revered in India as well. And he was actually more successful and more instrumental in the independence movement for India than Gandhi was. But Gandhi's the guy everybody knows. He gets all the credit. The next one, this is one that's going to blow your mind. And some people might get a little pissy about this at first, but I assure you it's 100% true. And that is the idea that George Washington was America's first president. That's what we're taught. We're taught that he's the first president, and to this day we still count the presidents from him. But it's not true. During the American Revolution, the Continental Congress actually chose Peyton Randolph to be the first president. And under Randolph, one of the Congress's first moves was to create the Continental Army that was going to fight the British. And they appointed General George Washington as the commander of that army. Randolph was succeeded in 1781 by John Hancock, who actually presided over independence from Great Britain. Now, after Washington defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown, President Hancock sent him a congratulatory note. When Washington sent his reply back to John Hancock for that congratulations, Washington addressed it to the President of the United States. Okay? Now you can see this. This letter back to Hancock still exists. So you can look it up and actually see it for yourself. 8 years later, as a revered war hero and living legend, Washington actually became President of the United States. Now, he was America's first popularly elected president, the first one that the people voted for, but he was not the first president of the country. In all reality, he was actually the 15th president of the country. There was 14 other guys before him that were appointed president by the Congress over many years. So the idea that Washington is our first president is not true. Now, if we want to say Washington is the first popular elected president, we can say that. The first president elected by the people, we can say that. If you even want to say that George Washington is the father of our country, I would even say we could say that because he inspired, a lot of confidence in the nation. And there was a lot of people that actually wanted him to become a king, and he didn't. But I would say, honestly, that the father of our country, that honor, I think, would fall to Jefferson more than Washington, honestly. Because Thomas Jefferson was the guy that wrote the Declaration of Independence, or the overwhelming majority of it. Him and John Adams pushed him to write it. Jefferson didn't want to write it at first because he didn't think that he was skillful enough to write it. But John Adams wanted him to write it because he didn't think that the Congress would accept it coming from him. Because basically, this is great, because basically John Adams was a first-class prick. Nobody liked John Adams in the Congress. People hated him because he was boorish and he was rude and he just did not have any civility towards everybody else. He had, the decorum of the day for Congress, but he was sarcastic, so people didn't really like John Adams that much. So he knew that if he wrote it, that the whole independence movement didn't have a chance in hell because nobody liked him. But everybody liked Thomas Jefferson. So he thought, hey, I'll get this guy to write it because everybody loves this guy. You know what I mean? And they'll actually read it then. So he sat down with Thomas Jefferson and with Benjamin Franklin, and they discussed it. And then Thomas Jefferson went off and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And one of the greatest documents ever written, by the way. If you have never read the Declaration of Independence, do yourself a favor and read it, because it is an amazing document. People talk a lot about our country and about our past being not the best, but the ideals that this country is founded upon are the greatest in history. Read our founding documents and you will find a new passion and a new love for our great nation. Really a great thing. You should definitely check it out. We're going to stick with the Revolutionary War era right now, and the next one is going to be Paul Revere and his famous Midnight Ride, where he rode through the streets yelling, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" and warned everybody and prevented all this massacre and all this stuff. It's one of the most iconic scenes in the Revolutionary War. In all reality, it's not true. It's not really what happened. In fact, the valiant Paul Revere, riding on horseback, yelling the British are coming and everything, the only place that's really ever actually found in history is in a poem that's titled Paul Revere's Ride by Longfellow. And that actually was written 85 years after the ride took place, supposedly. Now, obviously, Longfellow was not a historian. He's a poet. And he took a hell of a lot of liberties to make Paul Revere look as heroic as possible. But it wasn't real. I mean, the truth is that Paul Revere's ride wasn't seen as that big a deal in his own time. In fact, it wasn't even mentioned in Paul Revere's own obituary. Now, you would think something that famous and something that monumental as we make it out to be today definitely would have been mentioned in the obituary, but it wasn't. They didn't even talk about it. Okay, for starters, he didn't do it alone. Okay, he was not the only guy that rode and warned people. He was joined by several others who helped warn of the British forces coming. We know of at least 2 other men that also made that ride that night. One was Samuel Prescott, and the other one was William Dawes. So that's the first thing, is that he wasn't the only guy that rode. Basically, I think they sent riders in each of the 4 directions: north, east, south, and west. Okay, we know who 3 of them are. The 4th guy, we don't know his exact name, but a lot of historical accounts say that it was a black patriot that actually did the ride. He was the 4th guy. His name just wasn't recorded, but it was a black man that did it. Now that is going to shock a lot of people because they think there's no way a black guy could have done that in the Revolutionary period. Weren't all black people slaves? Weren't they the scum of the earth then? Didn't we hate them? That's also one of those myths that just isn't true. If you go to the YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, James Hershey Jr., there is an episode I did on black patriots of the Revolutionary War. Do yourself a favor, if you haven't listened to that, and give that a listen. It'll blow you away. There were so many patriots that fought for this country and helped form this country that were free black men. The idea that every black person during that time period was a slave is just simply false. There were a lot of black people in this country from the very beginning that never were slaves. They were free. Now, I'm not saying slavery did not exist, but what I'm saying is that not every black person was a slave, and there was a lot of black people that fought for this country in the Revolutionary War to give us freedom and independence from England. There was even an entire unit that was made up of nothing but black soldiers. You don't learn that in history class, do you? But it's an absolute truth. Check out that video that I did, and you will learn so much about this. I went into such detail, and with names and dates and everything. You will really, really enjoy that show. The second thing is that there's no way that he shouted, "The British are coming, the British are coming." That is just from the poem. It's complete nonsense. There's 2 reasons for that. First reason was that it was a secret mission he was on. He had to evade the British patrols. So there's no way in hell he's going to ride through the streets screaming, "The British are coming, the British are coming," when he's trying not to get caught. Okay, that never happened. He would ride to places and he would let them know discreetly what was going on, but he did not scream it in the streets. The second thing is the fact that he would not say the British are coming anyway, because the majority of America at that time were all British. That's where everybody came from, was England. And they considered themselves British citizens. Or subjects, actually, British subjects. So all it would have happened if he would have rode down the street screaming, "The British are coming," is everybody would have got confused, because they were British. So what the hell was he trying to say? He wouldn't have said that. Most likely what he would have said, had he been yelling in the streets, which he was not, but if he had, he would have been screaming, "The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming," because that's what they called them. So that whole story is nonsense. And the funny thing is that the other people that made those rides were way more successful in warning people than Paul Revere was. Paul Revere succeeded in getting himself caught almost immediately. So he didn't really accomplish anything. He was actually the very worst one out of the 4. But he's the one that everybody remembers. The next one is about Benjamin Franklin and the whole idea that he wanted the national bird to be the turkey instead of the eagle. This is one of those ones that has a little bit of truth to it, but a lot of myth to it. In 1782, they chose the Great Seal of America with a bald eagle on the front, and ever since then, the rumor that Benjamin Franklin wanted the wild turkey to become the national bird has been spread out there. There's a little, like I said, a little bit of truth, but mostly myth. Benjamin Franklin thought that the design for the eagle in the original seal looked more like a turkey than an eagle. Okay, that's where this begins. And since it looked more like a turkey than an eagle, he decided it would be fun to compare the two. He didn't like the bald eagle, and he actually said that the bald eagle was a bird of bad moral character. That's what he called it, because of its tendency to steal food from other birds. And he thought that the turkey was much more courageous and respectable, even though it looked kind of, vain and silly. It looked like it was a proud bird because that way it, would puff out its chest and stick up its feathers, and then it was silly looking. So the part that Franklin actually preferred the turkey over the eagle is 100% true. Now, where this becomes myth is the fact that he never actually made that public. Okay, he never said that in public. At least there's no record of it. Where that comes from is a letter that he wrote to his daughter. Now, he did actually make a public suggestion for what he believed the seal should be, and it was not the turkey. Benjamin Franklin's suggestion for the Great Seal of the United States was actually a scene in which Moses and the Pharaoh were seen, okay? That is what Franklin wanted the Great Seal to be, was Moses and the Pharaoh, not a turkey. Okay, so that's the part that is completely a myth. We have like 9 minutes left in the show, so I'm going to try to run through some of these really fast so I can get to more of them. The next one is the cowboy hat. Basically, this is the idea that every cowboy in the West wore the big Stetson cowboy hat that we all know and love. That is simply not true. That's not what people actually wore in the Wild West until maybe the very, very end. Okay, because the Stetson wasn't even around until 1865. And it didn't become really popular until like the end of the 19th century. So basically it wasn't worn by cowboys, not real cowboys. There's a famous image of the Wild Bunch that shows you the kind of hats that most cowboys wore, which was the derby hat. It's also known as the bowler hat. The sombrero was also quite popular in that time, and some of the more fancy guys would have been wearing a top hat. The next one is the War of the Worlds. Everybody remembers that. It was a radio show done by Orson Welles that's based on H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds. The story goes that he did this radio broadcast, and it caused this widespread panic around the country. Everybody freaked out thinking that the Martians were coming, we were being invaded, we were all going to be eaten alive or whatever, and there was a massive panic. Not true at all. Now, there might have been a few people that actually thought it was a real report, but those people should have been wearing helmets and flippers because they were not very smart people. Because the truth is that every single commercial break, they said that it was fake, that it was a dramatization, it was not real, that this was not a news report. Also, not very many people actually heard the original broadcast because it was on a show that wasn't very popular. And it was up against a whole lot of other popular shows during that time frame. And so the actual people that listened to it was very, very low. So that whole idea that it caused this huge panic is completely false. And it comes from the newspapers of the time because there was a rivalry going on between newspapers and radio because radio was becoming popular and newspapers had always been the way people got news and entertainment, and now it was becoming radio. So they were trying to smear radio as being dangerous, and that's where that story comes from. The next one is the idea that during the stock market crash of 1929 that all the Wall Street people were jumping off buildings killing themselves. All the bankers and brokers were just committing suicide by jumping out of windows into tall buildings and stuff. That's a myth as well. The suicide rate in New York in the months that followed the crash actually went down. And that makes sense because it's really common after a tragic event. People usually just don't kill themselves. It actually goes down. Now, several prominent figures did commit suicide during that time, but it wasn't by jumping out of windows. There was only 2 people that actually jumped out of windows after the crash. That's all. So the idea that it was these massive amounts of people jumping off buildings and killing themselves because of the crash is nonsense. The next one is about pilgrims and the way they looked. If you are asked to describe a pilgrim, then most likely you're going to say that it's a person that's dressed in a simple black and white outfit with buckles all over it and a real large hat. Okay, that's how we think of the pilgrims. That's not how they dressed at all. They came from England, so they dressed in the Elizabethan clothes that were common in that era. The records from the Mayflower, such as like wills and cargo logs and all that, they give us a good idea of pilgrims and what they wore. They liked colorful clothing, and they actually brought a lot of dye with them to America, the New World, so that they could dye their clothes that they made there a lot of bright colors. They also didn't wear buckles at all. The reason was because buckles were very, very expensive. Lace was a lot cheaper. So usually when they wanted to accessorize their outfits, they used lace, not buckles. The next one is that the idea that gladiators fought to the death constantly. That's not true. There were deaths in the arena, but it was a rare thing. The majority of gladiators did not die in the arena. They did get wounded. There were fights to death on rare occasions, but it was not the norm. The majority of people got wounded. Even if they lost, they were spared, they healed, and they went back and they fought again. You got to think about this logically. They were the prize fighters of the day. Okay? Now, somebody like that is a valuable person. They're worth money. You're not going to just kill them off so easily because they make a lot of money for you. They're popular. Now, there were a lot of deaths in the Colosseum, but usually they were Christians being fed to lions and chopped down and stuff. And there were a lot of criminals that were executed in the Colosseum and arena as well. But usually the gladiators weren't the ones that were dying. The next one is the idea of gunfights in the Wild West. The idea that they happened all the time. That, you would go out there at high noon and draw, and you would pull your gun and shoot. That almost never happened. That was something that comes from film and paperbacks and stuff like that. But it did not happen very often at all. And the last one I'm going to talk about, because we are pretty much out of time, is probably the most famous myth of all time. And this is another one that has to do with George Washington. This is the idea that he chopped down the cherry tree. We've all heard that in school, and we've been told that so many times, where, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, and he was asked, "Did you chop down this cherry tree?" And he said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It is I who chopped down that cherry tree." That is complete rubbish. It absolutely never happened. Complete, total myth. Another myth about Washington is that he had wooden teeth. That's one that's told a lot as well. He did not have wooden teeth. He had porcelain teeth. He had some ceramic teeth. He had teeth made out of bone and all kinds of different teeth. But he did not have wooden teeth at all. That's another myth. I'll close with this. A very fun fact about Washington. Washington loved ice cream. Absolutely loved it. So much so that he spent over $10,000 in one single summer just on ice cream. Now, $10,000 then is equal to several $100,000 now. So imagine that, spending several $100,000 on ice cream in one summer. But Washington was not a chocolate ice cream guy. He was not a vanilla ice cream guy. He was not a strawberry guy. He would not have enjoyed very much the Neapolitan ice cream that we like today. The flavors were a little bit different back then because ice cream was basically homemade. And the flavor profiles of those people were a lot different. His favorite ice cream, are you ready for this? This is terrible, was actually oyster. So the majority of that $10,000 that he spent on ice cream was spent on oyster flavored ice cream. Yummy. There was a hell of a lot of myths that I didn't get to. I apologize. I made a list yesterday of all the myths I could think of, and I admit it was very ambitious. So I didn't get to them all.
Thank you, brother. And this was pretty interesting because I didn't know some of this stuff, guys. I really didn't. I mean, Edison, I heard some stuff about Edison taking people's ideas and stuff like that and then using it for his own and using it for his own and taking credit for it. I've heard about that because here in California, Southern California, Edison, it's out here. So I've heard stories about that. And, about the devil being not red. He's not. That was something made up. He doesn't have a pitchfork. You're not going to go down into there and he's going to stick you with it. He actually was one of the most beautiful. It was the most beautiful angel in heaven, what they say. So he doesn't look like that. I don't know where that came from. Some people say it was put there to scare people in the early 16 and 1500s. Somewhere around there, they did that to scare people with Dante's Inferno. So they used that. That was some of the where they got it from. Newton, I didn't know about that. You know, I always heard it. I didn't believe the apple hit on his head. I knew that part didn't. I didn't know his sister had wrote something, so it's just hearsay. And I figured that because most stuff is hearsay. Most people say something and it gets turned into legend or then myth, and then you never know what really happened at that time. That's really crazy. Napoleon being short, 5'7", still kind of short, but I understand what they said. I got it. He was his rank when he first got in the military. He thought he was somebody, a little corporal, but he was really, he thought he was a bigger man than he was. I get that, and a lot of people think he's like 5'3" or something. That's funny because they always portray him as that. I don't know if you ever seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, guys. But Napoleon was there, and he was like a short French guy, and he was always mad. That was another thing. They said he was always angry, so I don't know if that was true either. But that's what they portrayed him as. So he was a weird guy anyway, to what I've read. Just everything James says. I mean, he finds out all this stuff, and it's very interesting. Some of these myths and legends and stories that people say, like George Washington had wooden teeth. I knew that wasn't true. That was a rumor. And I've heard that since I was a kid. I used to get taught that he had wooden. That's the crazy thing. Oh, he brought that up, and when I was in school years ago, that they used to teach us that he had wooden teeth and all that, and he was the first president, and that's what they teach you. And like I was telling James, I've heard of there's different presidents before him, but after the war, he was the most popular because people voted for him at that time because they originally wanted to make him a king, but he said, no, he didn't want to be a king. I remember that. I'm just going because I haven't been to school for years. So James gets into this history stuff, and he knows all this stuff. He goes for hours and days. He could live in a library if he could, guys. And trust me, he would. He'd use the books as pillows because, trust me, he loves all this stuff. He reads up on it. He finds out the truth. He finds out if they're lying. Like Columbus, I knew that. He actually, I think he sailed to South America. And I think what the guy 500, 600 years before him, the guy was I think it was a Viking, Eric the Viking. I think that's who it was. I don't know his whole name. I know he found America first, but I mean technically, some people say the Chinese did, and then there's other stuff it's been saying. But I know that Columbus found South America, and people give him credit, but he was not the best guy either. He was a jerk too. I heard, and he didn't really treat people right, and he betrayed people. And when he came here, he didn't treat people right. He killed them. I've heard. I don't know why we even celebrate Columbus Day, but it's interesting when James finds all this stuff out. I was just doing this real quick because we didn't have a lot, because this was a long show, guys. So he had to give me like very few minutes on this one, because usually I get to talk for a while about all this stuff, but I didn't get a chance to because it's a lot of information. It's a long show, and it takes a lot of time. These hours shows that he does isn't that he did an hour worth of studying. He does hundreds of hours of studying, so that's where he gets all this stuff. So I'm glad he talks to you guys about this, because it's not just about paranormal. We did this history stuff, and this is some stuff that people should know that has been exaggerated and with Adam and Eve. We don't know if that was an apple. That's just something that could have been a fruit, a fig at that place, because in that part of the area, apples didn't grow. So it could have been a fruit. It could have been some kind of fruit we don't even know about. A fig, maybe a melon or something, some kind of fruit that doesn't exist now. There was different stuff back then, so it could have been anything. So I'm glad he told us about these different stories, and I enjoy it, and I get to talk about them. That's always fun, and I get to put my opinions on it. Like Shakespeare, he just stole other people's plays and other people's stories and legends, and he made plays of them, and he wasn't the original author of all these things. He just took credit for it. There's a lot of people who do that. I've heard it even today. People with movies, they just stole the ideas from people. I'll give you one. A lot of people, and then I'll hurry up and get done. Rocky was a real fighter, but what I've read, and there was a documentary about it, is Stallone stole that story from this real fighter. I think it's a guy who fought was it Muhammad Ali? I don't really know if it was Muhammad Ali or somebody else. It was some famous fighter, and I don't know if it was Muhammad Ali. I don't remember exactly who it was. It was a famous fighter, and he dropped him, and people were surprised. And he ended up losing that fight, but that's who Stallone stole the story from Rocky. People don't really know that either. And the guy confronted him, and he just said it. Stallone laughs about it, and actually told him he was going to give him money for it, and never did. Kind of screwed him over. So there's a story for you guys. I know that it's not like these guys, but that's just showing you an example. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you, James, and thank you for the information, brother. I want to thank everybody for listening to the show. It was really interesting to learn some of this stuff. You guys can check us out on ParaX Radio. You guys want to follow us and listen to our other old shows on YouTube and our newer shows, follow James Hershey Jr. on his YouTube page. Subscribe. Check us out. We have our Facebook pages too. James Ash, a.k.a. Old Boy, and James Hershey. We also have a merchandise page with a bunch of stuff on it. You can guys get shirts, blankets, all kinds of stuff. So check it out. You can even get something special made. So I hope everybody has a wonderful night. Blessed be Misfits, Sugar Ladies, Monster Hunters, and Demon Lovers. I love you. Have a great night.
Thank you all for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the show, and I hope that you learned something while you listened to it. There was a whole lot more that I wanted to get to, but we just ran out of time. We honestly did not have time to get to them all. So, once again, thank you. I appreciate you, and until we speak to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. God loves you, and so do we. Bye-bye.